starting us off at number 10 is the knocking. On a voyage to space back in 2008, Yang Liwei became the first Chinese astronaut to venture into space aboard the Shenzhou 5. On the night of October 16th, Yang had a very peculiar sound coming from outside. It sounded like someone was knocking. The sound sounded like an iron bucket being hit with a wooden hammer. The scariest part of it all was that the sound wasn't coming from the inside of the spaceship and it wasn't coming from the outside, which makes no sense because space is a vacuum and you can't hear anything. Noise literally doesn't exist. Sound waves need a medium like water or air to pass through, so how did that even happen? Riddle me that, yeah? What makes this whole thing even weirder is that astronauts aboard the following Shenzhou 5 and 6 missions heard the same knocking. So was it a mechanism on the Shenzhou spaceships that caused this knocking to be heard? I don't know. I ain't a damn astronaut. Coming in at number 9 are space snakes. So this one comes from Dr. Story Musgrave, a man who has 6 academic degrees, was part of the Marine Corps, is a physician and mathematician, and he's a bloody NASA astronaut as well. Oh, and he shares the record of most space flights ever taken. So I mean, this man has literally lived 9 lives in one. Like, save some jobs for the rest of us, I swear to God. I'm just trying to get by at this point. Either way, a story said on 2 of his missions, he saw something out there that he doesn't have an answer to. He saw a snake sort of thing. It was 6 to 8 feet long, it was rubbery, and it had internal waves inside of it. And it sort of just followed him for an extended period of time. He claims that being in space makes you see things you'd never imagine. Well, no shit. And that he believes that there are creatures out there much more developed than any of us. And I mean, they've been out there for 100 million years. I'd hope as hell they're advanced. More advanced than us. But honestly, my theory on the snake is that they're just alien devices that just roam space and detect spacecrafts in the area and sort of tail them and send that information back to the alien HQ that deployed it, back to planet Blark. At number 8, we have decompression. So anytime a vessel goes on a voyage to outer space, the changes in atmospheric pressure the astronauts experience can be highly dangerous unless they're doing all the procedures correctly. The year was 1965, Soyuz 11 was re-entering Earth's orbit, and 3 crew members on board ended up dying when depressurized. A technician on the vessel back in Houston said while they were in the vacuum chamber, he accidentally depressurized his own spacesuit and then lost consciousness. He said the last feeling or sensation that he remembered was the moisture on his tongue beginning to boil. Rapid decompression is so serious, the symptoms can include vaporizing blood, swollen flesh, exploding eyeballs, and ruptured lungs. Can you imagine how screwed up the situation is when the moisture on your tongue is boiling? Say less. Also, do you guys like my nail color? I love it. Filling on number 7 slot is the green sighting. So Gordon Cooper is an astronaut that's flown the Gemini 5 and the Mercury 9. He was also the last American to ever spend time in space alone. In May of 1963, he was doing a circumnavigational trip around the Earth on the Mercury capsule, and when he was passing Perth, he saw something. A massive green glowing object came straight for him at a speed he'd never seen before. It was real, it wasn't just illusion, and the Machi tracking station in Western Australia even picked it up on their radar, so it was very much real. Cooper reported it to NBC, but when he landed was told they couldn't question him about it. So that's just another thing that they won't tell us. I feel like we should honestly start rioting until governments all over the world stop keeping from us. I'm over it. I've had enough. Now at number 6 is the alien music, which unfortunately cannot be found on Spotify or Apple Music, so you guys just don't even bother trying to find it. Just don't. Now back in 1969, 4 days after we stepped foot on the moon for the first time, astronauts John Young, Tom Stafford, and Gene Cernan were on the far dark side of the moon. And as Mufasa said to Simba, we don't go there. Now the 3 men were just chilling on the moon, taking pictures of the craters and drinking some grape juice, when they started hearing a strange otherworldly sort of noise inside their headsets. The music continued for a good hour, and none of the men had heard these types of sound before and knew no one would believe them if they told. They tried to find out where or what the music was, but they simply couldn't. Decades later, the mystery was just never solved, but some claim it was just sound coming from radio interference between spacecrafts, which I get, but how would 3 seasoned astronauts not know what that sounded like? Surely they would have heard that a billion times before as well. Why the hell you lying? Why the hell you lying? I made it PG. Coming in at number 5 is the Millennium Falcon, not to be confused with the one in Star Wars. While watching the ISS NASA live feed back in 2016, Jaden Beeson said he saw a metal spaceship. He said the UFO that he saw seemed similar to the Millennium Falcon found in Star Wars, so he realized he definitely needed to take a screenshot to prove what he was seeing. The metal craft had a blue glow to it and stayed hovering above Earth for about 2 minutes. And it's very clear to see it's not even a small craft by any means, you can definitely see it. Either way, Jaden sent the image to NASA, but he's never gotten an explanation or a response back, which makes the whole thing even that much more suspicious. All these craft just hovering above Earth and they're just going away? Why? Come in, you guys. We're friends. At number 4 is the cigar. A bit of background so you know how credible this really is. Musa Manarov was a Soviet Azerbaijani astronaut who holds a record for the longest continuous time spent in space. That record, 541 days. So he's had a lot of experience being in the Black Abyss and seeing everything. One day in 1991, he was on his way to the Mir space station when something caught his eye. On camera, he caught 2 minutes worth of footage of what appears to be a cigar-shaped UFO. It's just floating, lighting up at certain points, spiraling in every direction, and just actually there. But many say that it's hard to tell whether something is close or far away from you in space since you literally have no frame of reference. So you also can't tell how big or small it is. So this cigar could be bigger than Earth, or it could be smaller than me. We don't even know. Musa vehemently denied it being space junk because he's seen space junk many times and this ain't it. And considering he holds a record, I say we trust the man. He sounds credible. Filling our number 3 slot is Major Vladimir. Now, Major General Vladimir Kovalyanok was a cosmonaut in the 80s who saw something bizarre during the Salja mission. They were moving over South Africa when he saw an oval-shaped object. Now, initially it flew straight, but then an explosion of golden light occurred. A few seconds later, the oval object transformed into 2 golden spheres. After that, Vladimir just saw white smoke and the spheres just disappeared into thin air. He said he tried to take a picture of it, but it exploded before he had the chance. When he reported to Mission Control, it was all over Soviet headlines, magazines, newspapers, and most people excluded any option of it being extraterrestrial, but it did happen. It has no explanation whatsoever, and it was seen by not 1 but 2 people, Vladimir and his partner Viktor Savinykh. I hope I said that right. Savinykh. Now at number 2 are the other craft. So we all know about Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon and the whole leap for mankind spiel, but that was not the full story. According to Maurice Chatelain, the retired chief of NASA communications system, Armstrong saw things when he got off the spacecraft. Seconds before he stepped down the ladder, he saw 2 massive UFOs hovering above him, and Edwin Aldrin even took pictures of them. That was followed by 2 minutes of radio silence because one of the television cameras overheated and then lost reception. How very convenient. During those 2 minutes, there was a critical lost transmission, and that was Armstrong saying, "These babies were huge, sir, enormous. Oh God, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecraft out here, lined up on the far side of the crater's edge. They're on the moon watching us." And that was never made public. It was never even included in any of the records, and he refused to talk about it until his death. Thankfully enough, people had corroborated the evidence that we do know to be true, and I love how this massive part of history that has this whole other side to it we just didn't get told. I'm angry, I'm annoyed, but I wish Neil had told us because this is just shocking behavior on his part. Shocking. And finally, at number 1 is the check mark. Back in 2005, American astronaut Leroy Chiao had been the commander of the International Space Station for about 6 months at that point. One day he was installing some antennas 230 miles above Earth when something caught his eye. He saw the sequence of strange lights that seemed to be in a line that looked like an upside down check mark. Not Nike, it's not just do it. It's definitely not. But the formation flew by him and he was just flabbergasted at what the hell he had just seen. Skeptics tried to convince Leroy that what he had seen was just lights of boats reflecting upwards, but a reflection of lights is one thing. You know when something has its own life and it's moving past you. Reflections only move if the thing that's being reflected is moving, which they weren't. Riddle me that.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have an organic object. Leland Melvin is an American engineer and retired NASA astronaut who served on board the space shuttle Atlantis as a mission specialist. He is an incredibly brilliant man with an incredible resume, and that is exactly why this story is so unnerving. He claimed that, while on a space mission as he was orbiting Earth, which, for the record, How cool would it be able to tell a story that happened while you were orbiting Earth? It would be the only story I told for the rest of my life. But anyway, while he was on this mission, he said he saw a, quote, alien-like organic object. NASA disputed his claims and said that what he saw was just ice, but I feel like I trust the person who actually saw it with their own eyes. Leland went on to write that whatever he saw was, quote, translucent, curved, organic looking. I have no explanations to offer, but I will say it certainly is interesting and kind of terrifying. In our number 9 spot today we have DNA difference. Scott Kelly is an engineer, a naval aviator, and a former NASA astronaut, and for his interesting discovery on this list we have one that happened while he was in space, of course, but the results of it weren't really discovered until he was back here on Earth. Scott has a twin brother who is called Mark. While Scott was on a year-long mission aboard the International Space Station, Mark was, of course, here on Earth. Once Scott returned from his lengthy mission, him and Mark were both subjected to a 2-year-long study because, of course, since they were twins, it presented an interesting scenario. After the study concluded, NASA confirmed that 7% of Scott's genes were different. So basically, it was discovered that space changes your DNA. That's so wild, and it also makes me really wonder, even more than ever before, what other life forms out there look like then. While some of Scott's DNA expressions will change back to a closer version of what they were prior, it won't ever be 100% the same as it was before. In our number 8 spot today we have ocean maps. Gordon Cooper had an exceptional life and career as an aerospace engineer, test pilot, United States Air Force pilot, and he was the youngest of the 7 original astronauts in Project Mercury, which was the first human space program of the United States. It truly is astonishing, and the things he was able to accomplish, and one of the things he did, led to a dark discovery right here on Earth. While Gordon was up in space orbiting Earth in 1963, he began to make some maps. This was inspired by these dark spots that he observed in the Caribbean Sea. Later, a friend of Gordon, Daryl Miklos, who was an explorer, took these maps and began searching these locations that Gordon had marked as places of interest. Daryl thought he was going to find an ancient shipwreck, but instead, he found something that continues to stump researchers and Daryl himself. He came across a very strange structure that wasn't like anything that he had seen before. This structure had long obtrusions which stuck out from the sides, and the whole thing was covered in coral, so whatever this thing is, it has been down there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Daryl has said, quote, "There's identical formations in 3 different areas and they don't look nature-made, they don't look man-made, certainly nothing I've ever seen based on my experience, and I have years of experience at doing this. We've identified multiple different types of shipwreck material. This doesn't match or look anything like that." People have started speculating that this structure may just be the remains of a crashed UFO. If it isn't that, what else could it be? I'm feeling pretty open to suggestions. In our number 7 spot today we have the space snake. Dr. Franklin Story Musgrave is an American physician and retired NASA astronaut, and considering how credible he tends to be, despite the absurdities of this story, it makes it hard to pass off as a lie so easily. While he was in space, he claims that I saw something I don't wish upon anyone, a sort of space snake. He said that he saw an 8-foot-long white snake floating through space. I don't even know what I would do. Probably cry? Call Houston? I'm not sure. There are many people who think that this was simply just a detached hose from the spaceship, but Dr. Musgrave remains adamant on what he saw, and to be completely honest, I believe him. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. I mean, I don't know what happens in space, but I find it hard to believe that this person, who would likely be familiar with the parts of the spacecraft, mistook a hose for a snake. Also, how would they not notice an 8-foot-long hose missing? Again, I'm certainly no astronaut, it just seems strange. In our number 6 spot today we have animals. It is well known that prior to human spaceflight becoming a thing, in order to test out what space would do to a living being, we instead sent a monkey and a dog in our place first in order to study the effects. Morally, it's not the greatest thing we've done. In fact, it's horrible, but this has gone on to have an incredible impact on our ability to research space, and the sacrifices those animals unfortunately unwillingly made has not gone on in vain. This has, however, created quite a grim situation for some astronauts. Many of the animals sent to space were sent there with no plans of survival or even recovery. Yep, that means that there are animal corpses floating through space as I make this video and as you watch it. How terrible! It has been said that unfortunately sometimes the astronauts on space missions have to encounter these grim situations, but I'm sure it makes them all the more grateful for the sacrifice and the terrible things that these animals must have endured. In our number 5 spot today we have this mysterious video. In 1991, the cosmonaut Musa Manarov was on a mission in space when he captured a video that has been raising questions ever since. I'll show the video first, and then we can discuss. Do you have any idea what that is just floating out in the middle of absolute nothingness? Well, neither do I, so we're on the same page. Whatever this shiny cylindrical object is, it has been stumping us for decades since the video was captured. There is even a CIA document that refers to this story and how strange and unexplainable it is. Maybe it's like the snake and it could just be a part of their spacecraft that had come off, but what if it's not? At this point, we may never know for sure. In our number 4 spot today, we have giant moon babies. You'd think I'm kidding, but just wait. Since the moon landing, conspiracy theorists have gone absolutely wild. Of course, we have the popular theory of how the moon landing never actually happened and that it was all shot in a studio. That's probably the most well-known one, but the one I'm about to tell you is perhaps the most terrifying and also my favorite. So this conspiracy mystery suggests that the moon landing was real, which it was. Don't get mad at me. And it starts off in 1969 after Armstrong had successfully landed on the moon. During this monumental Apollo 11 mission, NASA claims to have lost transmission for about 2 minutes, and those 2 minutes are gold for conspiracy theorists. There are people out there who believe that this quote transmission interruption is actually just a cover up for a secret message that Neil was sending back to NASA. It is said that he said, quote, "These babies were huge, sir. Enormous. Oh god, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecrafts out here lined up on the far side of the crater's edge. They're on the moon watching us. I don't know who they are or why their babies are so big, but this is perhaps the most bizarre space conspiracy theory I have ever heard. I mean, I wasn't there, so who am I to say that Neil Armstrong didn't discover giant alien moon babies, you know?" In our number 3 spot today we have the lights. Leroy Chiao was the commander of the ISS in 2005, and this is exactly when this strange sighting occurred. It is said that he wasn't the only one who witnessed this, however, as it is said that the entire crew was there to see this unexplainable occurrence along with him. Basically, it is said that they saw a strange set of lights while up in space. He went on to describe the lights and said that they were in a formation of an upside down V, and that they ended up just stumbling upon this bizarre situation after the formation flew past them. I'm just gonna say it, we're all thinking it, that sounds a lot like aliens. I just don't have any other possible explanations, and you're telling me that the whole crew saw it? I swear, nothing will convince me of aliens more than an astronaut's first-hand account. In our number 2 spot today we have glowing green. Back with another Gordon Cooper story, this time it's about something he witnessed in space and only in space. On May 15th, 1963, he was sent off into space in a Mercury capsule for a 22-orbit journey around the Earth, and while on this journey, he saw something extremely unsettling. A glowing green object that would approach his capsule. During his final orbit, he did tell the tracking station of this object that was quickly approaching his capsule, and they were able to pick up this UFO on their radar, but once Cooper landed, reporters were told that he was not allowed to answer any questions regarding this UFO. It is even more interesting considering how Gordon has been a vocal and firm believer in UFOs even before he was an astronaut. So I ask, what do you guys think this was? In our number 1 spot today we have the knock. Okay, space is a vacuum, right? So it should be silent, right? We've all heard about space roar, the alleged unsettling noise of space, but for the most part it should be relatively silent. That is exactly what makes this story the plot of a horror movie, in my opinion. Back in 2003, Yang Liwei became the first astronaut sent into space by the Chinese space program. That's an amazing accomplishment and likely a very exciting adventure, so imagine his surprise when, as he's sitting in his space shuttle, he hears a knock. He described it as, quote, someone knocking the body of this spaceship just as knocking an iron bucket with a wooden hammer. Okay, perhaps we could just chalk this up to some extremely reasonable explanation, but he's not the only one who's heard it. There were other Chinese astronauts between 2005 and 2008 who reported hearing similar sounds, and it's not like you can just open up the door to check. Next thing up, we need Ring doorbells for space shuttles, apparently.
At number 10, we have green and shiny. Gordon Cooper was doing one of the most amazing things a human being has ever done. He was completing a 34-hour orbiting flight around the planet. This was in May of 1963. I can only imagine he saw parts of Earth that most people only dream of. But during this flight, he didn't just get an amazing view and some awesome pictures for Instagram. Also, that is the future of space travel. Influencers are going to go up there and take a bunch of pictures in zero gravity, and then space is going to become a fad for all of the people who want to post it all over their social media. But anyways, during this flight, Gordon Cooper was approached by a green orbiting light that floated up to him in his spacecraft and then flew away. He was so amazed by this encounter that he talked in front of the UN, and he said that, I believe that extraterrestrial vehicles and crews are visiting our planet from other planets. Hey, this guy has been to space. If anyone knows, it's this guy. At number 9, we have incorrect. Do you guys know Chris Hadfield? You probably should, baby. He's got a master class. If you do it, they let you go to space. But here's one occasion where Chris was relaying information to the Russian Mir space station so they could dock on his ship. While this was happening, his sensors that tell him how far the station is started giving him the wrong information. This is terrifying to see because if they come in too slow, they won't latch, and then they'll just be both floating out there in the void of space. And if they come in too fast, then they crash and everyone dies. One sensor was telling Chris that they were 32 feet away, and another one was saying that they were 20 feet away. He thought that at least one of them had to be right, so he used his thumb to judge the distance and a stopwatch to judge the speed, and then realized that they needed a touch more speed and got the connection perfectly. Now this is all very nerdy stuff, but that is one of the most bad boss thug life things I have ever heard of in my life. The station weighs 250,000 pounds, and the connection they have to hit is the size of a DVD player, and he eyeballed it. Well, now I gotta take his masterclass. At number 8, we have Leroy's Lights. Leroy Chiao is a former commander of the International Space Station, which is one of the coolest titles I have ever heard in my life. While he was working up there, he witnessed something very strange. He saw a line of lights floating through the sky like it was some sort of formation. He said it looked like a grouping of UFOs flying in formation. He also said that it would be ridiculous to think that we are alone in the universe. And if he says that, it's gotta mean something, right? At number 7, something fell off. In 1991, Musa Manarov was on the Russian space station. He was watching a nearby shuttle do a very standard docking, and he decided it would be a good thing to get on camera. I mean, why not? How often are you up in space? Might as well take a few pictures to savor the moment. Now, what he did not expect to see was a little item fall off the spacecraft. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking it was just a piece of the ship detaching or something, but the shuttle was already latched. There wasn't any movement that should have jostled something loose from the spacecraft, and then this mystery item fell directly from the ship down towards Earth. It didn't float in space, and it's all on camera, so you can check it out for yourself. At number 6, we have Vlad and the Little Finger. In 1981, Vladimir Kolvanyuk was on board the Russian space station, and he took a peek out of one of the windows. He saw something strange. He said it wasn't really a UFO, but just a little small object. Even if it's just a little finger-sized device, because it's supposed to be space. There's nothing out there. Well, he watched this thing for a moment, and then it exploded. Maybe it was shy, I don't know. But it seemed that it wasn't some piece of debris or rock or something. There was something in it that made it explode. Maybe it was a UFO, just a very tiny one, or maybe it was some sort of surveillance device and exploded upon its own discovery. Whatever it was, it's gone forever now. At number 5, we have, was it just a reflection or something real? James McDewitt was in space in 1964, and he saw something that he couldn't explain. There was something floating out in space. He said it looked like a ship, but it was in the shape of a beer can, and it was glowing white. Now, when you hear something like this, you think aliens, and that's what all the press thought too when they heard this story, and they ran it. Years later, he reviewed reviewed some of the footage and he said what he saw was just a reflection. Now, what do you think? Could this have actually been something out in space and the government told him to keep his mouth shut, or was it just a reflection? And number 4, we have toxic ammonia. Okay, this list is teaching me that astronauts are some of the coolest people around. Bob Kerman was on the International Space Station installing a bunch of upgrades. You gotta keep that station looking good. Now, while he was out in space doing this, a valve blew and sprayed ammonia all over his spacesuit. And this is very bad because if he brought it back into the station, everyone would suffocate and die from the ammonia fumes. So he used his big brain. He floated out in front of direct sunlight because ammonia has a very low boiling point. This would burn the ammonia off of his suit. Another astronaut came out and then brushed his suit off, and everyone were mass breathing oxygen upon his re-entry just to be safe. Now look at the big brain on Brad. I mean, Bob. I meant to say Bob. Bob. And number 3, we have what is that noise? Seen or heard? They're two sides of the same coin. One being a little scarier than the other, but just reading this story really freaked me out, so I had to throw it on this list. This was back in 2003. China would launch Yang Liwei into space. Now, it wasn't just the trip of him being blasted in a rocket into the vacuum of space that was scary. Although the sounds of a roaring rocket ripping through the sky must be pretty terrifying. It was what happened after Yang got aboard the space station. That night he was there and he heard something very strange. There was a knocking coming from outside the space station. Now this is messed up for a lot of reasons. First, it's the vacuum of space. There shouldn't be anything floating around outside in space. And if there was, it shouldn't be alive long enough to knock. And the second reason, being even spookier than the first, it's the vacuum of space. It's the same reason as the first. Sound needs something to pass through so you can hear it, like air or water. As the old saying goes, in space, no one can hear you scream. So how could this have happened? Could this have just been something in the station that was making a weird noise? Maybe something was floating around loose and bumped against a wall? I don't know, but he heard it more than once. And number 2, we have the space eel. This sounds like the title of a cheesy horror movie that was made in the 1950s. We're gonna take two things we don't understand and put them together, and then you got a movie. Well, it's actually what Story Musgrave saw. He was an astronaut working with NASA, and one day while floating around through the endless void, he saw something very strange. It was a long white space eel. He said it had its own propulsion system to move through space. That sort of discredits anyone who thinks it was just some sort of inanimate object. And that kind of thing does happen. Things fall off of spaceships and space stations and they will just be debris out in the open, just loose and going. And if the propulsion system wasn't enough to convince you, he said he saw this thing not once, but twice. And for the number 1 spot, we have the moon landing visitors. I don't care what you think about the moon landing. If you believe in it, cool. If not, cool. Leave me alone in the comment sections, I don't care. But for the believers, when Neil Armstrong and his crew landed on the moon, there was a lost transmission that Neil sent out when he stepped foot onto the moon, and it went like this. These babies are huge, sir, enormous. Oh my God, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecrafts out here, lined up on the far side of the crater's edge. They're on the moon watching us. End quote. Apparently, there were 2 massive spaceships that were floating above them as they stepped out onto the moon. Now, this transmission was never released into the public until years later, and Neil didn't talk about it until right before he died. So if you don't believe in the moon landing, I guess this is a cover-up on a cover-up. Alright everyone, that has been our list, and as promised, I'm going to be doing some more pet shoutouts. Remember, if you want me to shout out your pet, you can hit me up on Instagram. I pick new pets every day, so if you don't get picked one day, you can message back another day. I usually pick who messaged last, so if you don't get picked, you can just message again and again and again. If it takes me a little while to get back to you, I'm very sorry. I have a lot of these to do. And without taking any longer, let's shout out some pets. First off, we have Luna, who has an amazing bow in her hair. Look at how cute that dog bow is. Man, everyone with a dog in quarantine, I am so jealous of all of you. Next up, we have Renee, who has some of the best shaggy hair of all time. That dog has great style. Then we have Bean, who has a little pot belly. Look at that little chunky belly. I love it. After that, we have the cat Lit. He is chilling in the sun super hard. I know he is having a dope day. That sunshine probably feels so good on him right now. And to top it off, we have Bo. Look at how majestic this good boy looks. He looks like he's supposed to be in a movie.
Number 10, a car crash. Let's start with the drama here. Pretty sure if you say you're an astronaut, people are going to look at you differently in a good way. Man, you've been to space. After all, you are a human being who has seen just how small the world is compared to the wide, wide universe. Many revere James Donald Halsell Jr. after the 5 space shuttle missions he took before retiring in 2006. But he must have hit the ground hard when he came down to Earth. Halsell was traveling in his car to West Monroe, Louisiana and stopped at a Motel 6. While there, he downed 3 glasses of wine before heading back on the road, which is a no-no. Therefore, tragedy struck. James crashed into a car, killing 2 of the young passengers in the vehicle who flew from the car when they crashed. He was going extremely fast and reportedly tried to steal a bystander's car when he stopped at the site. James told police that he didn't remember leaving the hotel or how the crash occurred. Though they found no drugs at the scene, police did find 10 empty sleeping pill packages back at the room. NASA declined to comment about the arrest. Very, very sad. Number 9. A love triangle. This one? Oh my god. This next one is pretty rough. We all know what it's like to go through a breakup. It's not fun. It sucks. It doesn't necessarily bring out the best in you. Mother of 3 and mission flight engineer as well as crew member on the 13-day shuttle mission, Lisa Nowak was a prominent figure in NASA's astronaut team. She was even the inspiration for Natalie Portman in the film Lucy in the Sky before she went all breakup song on her ex. In February 2007, Lisa drove from Houston to Orlando, Florida, wearing diapers, so she didn't have to stop, to confront the woman who she claims stole her man. She claimed she was going to have a calm conversation, but instead she ended up attacking her. She was in a wig and a trench coat and there was pepper spray. It was a whole ordeal. William O'Fallon and Nowak trained together and began an affair in 2004. Both divorced their partners, with Nowak thinking her future was with William. Wrong. William started exclusively dating Air Force Captain Colleen Shipman, and he thought Nowak took it well when he told her. Instead, she ended up sneaking into his apartment, read their email exchanges, and well, flash forward to a 900-mile drive, pepper spray, and nightmares Shipman will have for the rest of her life. Initially arrested on the attempted murder charges, they were dropped to less aggressive accusations like attempted burglary and kidnapping. Shipman and Bill are now married, while Nowak, after years of counseling, is doing much better, though she refuses to talk about the event for obvious reasons. I hope you're doing better. Number 8. Married to his work. NASA ended up wanting so little to do with this guy that they actually fired him. Today, divorce is about as common as breakups in high school. Though some happy news, it looks like the percentage is going down, but in the 60s, getting divorced was a major taboo. NASA's astronauts were about the closest thing to comic book heroes the world had ever seen, and they knew that public opinion was a huge part of their funding. So, when an astronaut hero misbehaved, NASA wasn't going to stand for it. Don Easel wasn't exactly a faithful husband, and he rarely visited his son, who was dying of leukemia. He also cheated on his wife multiple times at Cape Canaveral, which was flooded with eager groupies. He gaslighted his wife several times when she asked him to admit it, and when she suggested going to therapy if he thought she was crazy, he replied, "But I'll lose my job." Don and Harriet at last divorced, and NASA soon followed, firing Don as well. Bye, Don. See you later. Number 7. The Astronauts' Wives Club. Not a fun time. Speaking of astronauts behaving badly, let's talk about the reports of the Astronauts' Wives Club. These lovely ladies were used to a measly military pay when suddenly they became celebrities overnight, and given the aforementioned squeaky clean image NASA wanted to protect, any scandal was swept under the rug. According to the Astronauts' Wives Club, a true story by Lily Copel. On the outside, they were the ideal Stepford wives, apple pie baking, apron wearing beauties. But out of the 30 astronaut marriages from 1961 to 69, only 7 would stay married. The biggest wedge in the marriage was the time the men spent at Florida's Cape Canaveral, which I previously mentioned, which became off-limits playground. Cape Cookies became the name of the women who would magically appear to have their own rockets launched by the men who would touch the stars. To handle the silence and stress, the wives turned to excessive ways to self-medicate, the nightly gin and tonic with a tranquilizer garnish. Yeah. Pretty rough. Number 6. Fireflies. Ice particles, they said. Part of the capsule heat shield, they said. Could it have been that John Glenn saw something else instead? Glenn was the first American astronaut to orbit the planet in 1962. He was also one of the good ones. He and his wife Annie were married for 73 years. In fact, when he left to fight in World War II, he told her, and I quote, "I'm just going down to the corner store to get a pack of gum," to which she replied, "Don't be long." He said that every time he went away to war. She kept a gum gum wrapper in her purse every time after that. Anyways, grab a tissue, that's super cute, let's continue. Glenn, while flying over Australia, saw strange floating mass like tiny little stars outside the Friendship 7 capsule. When he tapped on the window, they flew off. Mission Control were at first concerned the anomalies were fragments of the heat shield, but that wasn't the case. No, it was something else. NASA has since explained the sighting as ice particles, but up until his death in 2016, Glenn never really believed it. His wife Annie finally joined him at peace, passing away due to COVID complications at the age of 100 in May 2020. Number 5. Space music. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, the first song played in space was Jingle Bells on the 16th of December 1965. It was broadcasted during NASA's Gemini GA spaceflight. Though there have been several musicians played out there in the big space ever since, there remains an artist unknown. Eugene Cernan in the Apollo 10 space capsule reported hearing a strange kind of music during a mission. What he described as a strange musical whistling sound, like how you would imagine space music to be, like the I can't do it. Just imagine very sci-fi. He reached out to NASA Mission Control to see if they'd heard it too. According to the mission transcripts released in 2008, the sounds were recorded. Of course, alien theories have spread far and wide, but NASA made no comment. Then, in the Apollo 11, Michael Collins recorded hearing the same sound while orbiting the moon. This time, NASA was prepared. They said it was, and I quote, interference between the LMs and command modules VHS radios, unquote. Sure it was, NASA. Sure it was. Number 4. Bright lights and beyond. It might surprise you to learn that not only do we have a ton of garbage down here on Earth, but a ton of space junk sits just above us. In fact, the estimate for just how much is staggering. Around 128 million pieces, about 6,000 tons of space debris in space. Earth's low orbit carries millions of rocket and spacecraft fragments along with dead satellites. Each one is flying around 18,000 miles per hour, so faster than a bullet? Yeah. So the likelihood of astronauts encountering space debris is pretty high, but this one example is pretty staggering. But that doesn't stop this case from being very strange. Brent Jett was in the STS-150 mission in 2006 on his way to help construct the ISS. But then he noticed, and I quote, some kind of reflective structure, unquote, outside the shuttle. According to him, quote, it doesn't look like anything I've ever seen outside of this shuttle, that's for sure, unquote. NASA took control of the camera and there were 3 bright objects in the sky. When they ordered an inspection of the craft, they saw nothing. Not even a hint. Space junk? Or aliens? NASA has no explanation and they won't talk about it, so what is it? And heading on to our top 3, number 3, the Gordo UFO. I suppose it's not too hard to guess that Major Gordo Cooper was a lover of all things space, but it turns out that his adoration goes deeper than that. In 1957, 30-year-old Cooper was test pilot and project manager of the fighter section of the Experimental Flight Test Engineering Division at Edwards AFB in California. 2 members of his crew one morning mentioned to him that they caught sight of a strange saucer-like object. It apparently didn't make a sound as it landed and took off. The 2 men took photos of the craft and Cooper was ordered to have the film developed, have no prints made, and send it right away to the Pentagon. He was also instructed not to look, but like of course he did. He saw exactly what the 2 men described and to his very deathbed insisted the government was covering it up. But not only that, on his 1963 solo trip, he had a close encounter that was broadcasted on NBC. He saw a glowing green object approaching and it was picked up on radar. But when he got to Earth, he wasn't allowed to talk about it. Number 2. Edits in space. Could NASA be editing the footage sent down from the International Space Station? This theory is hot among conspiracists. The idea really started to gain traction in July 2016. 2 different cameras 25 hours apart spotted a distinct square shape, larger than the Earth. Initially, UFO hunters concluded that it had to be some kind of unidentified object in our orbit, but another theory surfaced, that the shapes were actually attempts by NASA to edit something else out. Could it be meteors or a cover-up of something NASA has determined we are not ready to see yet? NASA was forced to deny that they didn't attempt a cover-up, but UFO hunters will never rest until the truth is revealed, even if it has been already, so we don't really know what's true. And last but not least, the Reich and NASA. Well, this is a surprising little tidbit, but honestly, I'm not too surprised. This is definitely worthy of being number 1, especially since NASA doesn't advertise it really at all. During World War II, the US recruited the help of over 1,600 German Yahtzee scientists. Yes, I said Yahtzee because apparently YouTube gets scared, they are Death Eaters. Anyways, they hired over 1,600 German Yahtzee scientists in institutes like NASA to increase their payroll. The code name for this operation was Operation Paperclip because of all the paperclips on the immigration files, which brought in Werner von Braun and his V-2 rocket team. The former SS officer would become a US citizen and was a key architect in the Apollo program. What? In 1977, he was awarded the National Medal of Science despite having previously hand-picked slave laborers in Buchenwald for his rocket building efforts. Yeah, so that's special. Starting off number 10, no life insurance? This first one is definitely out of this world. Neil Armstrong didn't have life insurance along with the entire Apollo 11 team. That sounds absolutely bonkers, especially considering the fact that he was leaving behind family on Earth, so if something were to happen, which was very likely, there was nothing left for them. And also like, what? But it was because they were doing something that was more dangerous than anything any human had ever done before that they just couldn't afford the life policy. Taking out a life insurance policy was nearly impossible, but the astronauts had something up their sleeve. While in quarantine, the crew signed hundreds of autographs and gave them to their family and friends. Even though eBay wasn't a thing yet, they knew that those autographs would be worth a pretty penny considering how famous the team was. Thankfully, they didn't really need to, but that didn't stop the autographs from being sold. One even got picked up at an auction recently for 30 grand. Number 9, Gordon Cooper. Gordon Cooper. I think the phrase never meet your heroes really applies here, because as we learned in the first part, a lot of early astronauts really let the fame get to their heads. Cooper was happy in his married life, so long as he maintained the happiness of his mistress, who was also a married woman. 4 months before he was chosen to be an astronaut, his wife, Trudy, had decided that enough was enough. She was tired of his infidelity and decided it was time to leave after 12 years of marriage and put it in the dust. But little did she know, as she walked away, she was taking away his life dream. As we learned in the first list, divorce wasn't a good look. Cooper begged her to come back, not because he regretted his ways, but more so because his dreams of going to space would be cancelled. So it's like, come back, I don't miss you though. Whether it was to help him or because she got 70 grand from a Life magazine segment, Trudy went back. They stayed married until he retired in 1970, when it no longer mattered if he was married, so hopefully Trudy got out of there, you know what I mean? Number 8, hidden treasure. Speaking of Mr. Cooper though, he did make some interesting discoveries up there in the sky that he kept pretty close to his chest. Cooper was apparently very talented at spotting sunken ships in the ocean from up in space. Gordon flew on the Faith 7 flight in 1963 and spotted several anomalies that had the potential of being, I don't know, gold-soaked shipwrecks? When he got home, he put them all on a map, which was a decade-long project. He hunted down and coordinated which ships they could be, but didn't tell anyone until decades later. The discoveries came out in 2017 when a treasure hunter, Daryl Miklos, used the maps Cooper made to make a TV show. There were 100 sites Cooper speculated were shipwrecks, and the first 5 were correct, and he just kept turning up right. Good for you, Cooper. Good for you. Number 7, what's the buzz? Speaking of buzz, remember to head over to Bumblebee if you want to see more of me doing this, because this is what we do over there too, but quirkier. Anyways, enough of that. The buzz we are talking about is Buzz Aldrin. Now Buzz did some pretty incredible things, but the side of Aldrin NASA doesn't love talking about is, well, yes, the married life. Apparently Buzz wasn't really an emotional guy, so to help his wife cope, he gave her a pet monkey in 1966. They had one before who had recently died, but this one was like nothing like the docile thing they had before. It hated his wife. It would make fun of his wife, bare its teeth, like use profane finger language. It was very strange. Eventually, his wife got so upset that she said to her husband, "It's either the monkey or me, someone's leaving," to which Buzz replied dryly, "What are you waiting for?" Ouch. She stayed and put up with the monkey and the primate until 1974. After Buzz came back from space, he took up drinking and had many affairs, so they eventually divorced. Number 6, toilet trouble. Toilet humor can be a little taboo of a comedy topic sometimes, despite the fact that farts will always be funny. But you know a stand-up comedian is like digging for comedy and like just trying to get a laugh if they're using toilet humor, you know what I mean? Anyone agree with that? But I'm not surprised they don't talk about it that often. I mean, it's not pleasant to imagine anyone doing the number 2, but it's even more so whilst in space, because how does that work? In space, gravity likes to be a little finicky because there isn't any. From taping bags to astronauts' butts to vacuums, right? Helping an astronaut do their duty proved more difficult than they imagined. They made pants astronauts could wear which could hold up to 3.75 cups of urine, and even a 50-grand toilet you had to be strapped into. NASA's Scott Weinstein had to teach the crew to use it and said that it was all about alignment. The hole was a quarter the size of the one that we have in our toilets, and some of them had to use an under-the-seat camera so they could like get perfect aim every single time. Today it's less complicated. They sit on a tiny hole and a vacuum sucks the stuff away. Who would have thought a basic human action would be so hard in space? Number 5. Money, money, money? Take a guess. Right now, watching this video, how much do you think an astronaut gets paid to venture where no human has gone before? Yeah, like take a minute, I'll wait. Long enough. My first guess was like at least like 700 grand or like millions, because you're literally risking your life where no one can save you. Even though most astronauts don't actually end up going to space, but at least the ones that do, right? But the actual number may surprise you. Astronauts are paid by the federal government's general schedule pay scale, and they usually qualify for GS13/14, the highest being 15. This means that they can make anywhere between 100 grand to 161 grand. Hey, to someone like me that's got like 2 to 3 jobs minimum to pay rent, that sounds pretty good. But somehow that doesn't seem quite enough for what they do, or does it? Anyways, by comparison, fish and wildlife administrators are reportedly paid the same. So, I don't know. How do we feel? I guess the main perk is being able to say you made it to space unless you're doing most of the work on the ground. Thoughts? Number 4, the Challenger. The Challenger was one of the most devastating moments in aerospace history. It was literally the worst case scenario that astronauts probably have nightmares about. On January 28th, the world watched in horror as 73 seconds into the launch of the Challenger, it exploded in mid-air, taking with them 7 astronauts, including Christy McAuliffe, the first civilian in space. The reason for the explosion was because of the 2 rubber O-rings which were designed to seal the sections of the rocket booster failed. On the morning of the launch, temperatures were unusually low, which put the craft at risk. Engineers warned against launching. Due to media hype and the pressure, they pressed forward, which was the deadliest mistake they could make. NASA tried to ease the public by saying the crew was probably unconscious when it happened, but more research revealed that they were awake and aware, so needless to say, not something astronauts love talking about. Number 3, Thad Roberts. This next one isn't entirely PG, so like there's a warning for you. But Thad Roberts decided one day that the Mile High Club just wasn't cool enough for him. Thad Roberts always wanted to be the first man on Mars, but he ruined his chances of that for life. I don't know why. Thad stole $20 million worth of lunar rock so he could touch the stars. He, along with accomplices Tiffany Fowler and Shay Soar, used their official IDs to break in and steal the safe the rocks were in. They took it to a motel, broke it open with a chainsaw, and then scattered them on the bed. Tiffany and Thad then joined the 384,000 kilometer club before trying to sell them to an interested buyer. However, their lovemaking contaminated the rock samples, which made them useless to the scientific community. They were eventually caught by the FBI, and Roberts was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Also, he could say he had sex that was out of this world. Next up, number 2, questionable water. This next one isn't technically a secret, but it's definitely something that's a little embarrassing to talk about. We've talked about some crazy survival stories on Bumblebee channel, and one of them included drinking urine to survive. Something a lot of survivalists don't recommend unless absolutely desperate. Essentially, if you consume your own urine, you are consuming the toxin your body tried to get rid of. But NASA has found a pretty neat way to make it fashion. Astronauts in space actually drink their own urine, but that's after the ship has transformed it back into water. They've been drinking their recycled urine since 2009 aboard the ISS, so I guess anytime they are thirsty, they just go to the washroom. The toilet they use, as mentioned above, uses powerful acids to help control fungal and biological growth. They don't recommend doing this without this technology, obviously, just in case that idea popped into your head. Currently though, they are looking at tech that might be able to pull water from the air, but they are still far from that. And last but not least, the Apollo 11 hoax. The moon landing hoax is still alive and well, and true or untrue, astronauts aren't likely to be heard talking about it because it lives in the realm of conspiracy. We have probably talked about it on this channel. If you can find one video about it, post it below. On July 20th, 1969, the first astronauts landed on the moon. It was a race between the US and the Soviet Union to put their flag on some moon cheese, and we beat them. They beat them. I'm Canadian. Right? Forgot. But ever since conspiracy after conspiracy has sprung, 5% of Americans reportedly still believe that the moon landing was faked. About 16 million people. You would think that NASA would just like put this conspiracy to bed, but the video that showed the landing apparently disappeared. So that's convenient.
Starting off this countdown, we have the fear of the unknown. During an interview with astronaut Chris Hadfield, he said that the thing he feared the most about going into space was the fear of the unknown, because anything can go wrong at any time. Plus, no matter how much you prepare, there's no way you can prepare for everything that could go wrong, because you don't know everything that can go wrong. Plus, astronauts are miles away from home with limited supplies and contact. They're pretty much on their own to save themselves if anything does go wrong. So it's the fear of not knowing what's to come that terrifies them. In our 9th spot, we have space junk. Obviously, space is filled with floating space objects, but also tons of man-made junk, like debris from old satellites, rocket ship pieces, lost equipment, you name it. It said that there are 28 million pieces of space debris floating around up there. That's about 6,000 tons of space debris. On top of that, each piece flies around at 18,000 miles per hour. At any second, debris could crash into the astronaut's spacecraft and wipe them out. In fact, it said that even tiny paint flecks can damage a spacecraft when traveling at these velocities. Imagine what anything larger could do. So space junk is certainly something astronauts fear. I mean, I wouldn't be able to sleep. I would be way too paranoid. In our 8th spot, we have loss of communication. When astronauts are in space, they rely on ground control to help them out. Ground control plays a critical part in the space mission success. They make sure that everything goes as planned and that the craft stays on course. So imagine how frightening it would be to all of a sudden lose contact with them. Astronauts are then left alone just floating through space. They then would have to manually fly their spacecraft home. Astronauts have lost connection a couple of times, but it's only been for a couple of hours. Moving on to number 7, we have the toxic atmosphere. According to NASA astronaut Drew Morgan, he is worried about space's toxic atmosphere. He admitted to this on social media when responding to a comment that read, "What is the biggest and most terrifying thing astronauts fear about being in space?" There are a number of things in space that make it so deadly for astronauts. For starters, exposure to space can cause embolism, hypoxia, and hypocapnia. Not only that, but astronauts can get sick from being on the moon. When the Apollo astronauts returned from the moon, they got sick off of the moon dust on their spacesuits. It made their throats sore and eyes water. The particles are so fine, but sharp like glass. In fact, it said that, and I quote, "Particles 50 times smaller than a human hair can hang around for months inside your lungs. The longer the particle stays, the greater the chance for toxic effects." But there are so many other things in space that can have a negative impact on the astronauts, like exposure to UV rays and radiation, which can cause cell mutation. Also, there's no pressure in space. The lower the pressure, the lower a liquid's boiling point is. But since in space there is no pressure, the boiling point can easily drop to an astronaut's body temperature, meaning their blood and other liquids in their body would start to boil. Not a pleasant way to go, that's for sure. In our 6th spot, we have the depressurization. Astronaut Drew Morgan claims that astronauts are also scared of depressurization. He said, and I quote, "There's always the possibility that we could depressurize, or that a hole could be punctured by a micrometeoroid or something and we could leak our atmosphere overboard." So let's say that an astronaut was exposed directly to the vacuum of space. space. Since space doesn't have atmospheric pressure, the astronauts' lungs will expand and burst. After that, the water in their soft tissues will vaporize, causing their whole body to swell up. Then bubbles would form in the veins, blocking blood flow, and the astronauts' bowels, bladder, and stomach will explode, expelling their contents. But don't worry, the astronaut would die from loss of oxygen first before all of that happens. Still, it's terrifying to think of. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with getting sick. In space, there's no hospitals, there's no nurses, there's no doctors. So if you get sick or injured, you're on your own. You need to rely on your crew members to help you out. This is another fear for astronauts, getting sick while in space or seeing their crew get sick while in space. Also, if one person gets sick somehow, chances are others will too. Space is a pretty germy environment. When a person sneezes on Earth, the snot particles shoot out about 3 to 6 feet, and then gravity knocks them out of the air into the floor. But in space, there's no gravity, so if an astronaut sneezes or coughs, it's lingering in the air for their companions to breathe in and enjoy. As a result, sickness or diseases can spread really fast. Another fear they have is dying in orbit, because A, that would suck, and B, what are the crew members supposed to do with the astronaut's dead body? They'll be stuck living beside it for days until they return home. Has to be traumatizing. Moving on to number 4, we have the mechanical failures. This is another fear that Chris Hadfield brought up that's common among astronauts, and that's fear that they will experience some sort of mechanical failure or defect, whether that be during liftoff, while in orbit, docking, or re-entry. I mean, there have been a number of disasters already, like the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds into the flight. As a result, the shuttle broke down over the Atlantic Ocean and all 7 crew members on board lost their lives. This was due to a failure of the O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. In space, if their spacecraft fails or if their systems malfunction, they're pretty much screwed, so no one can come out there to save them. Moving on to number 3, we have floating off into space. Although it's never happened to any astronauts so far, it's a very real fear that astronauts have. And hey, I don't blame them. Anyways, if astronauts spacewalk, they have to tether themselves down. If those tethers fail, oh boy, they're drifting out into space. No matter how much they kick or flail their arms, it won't bring them back to the shuttle. Now, NASA does have these emergency jetpack things that can help fly them back to safety, but if the fuel runs out, they're in trouble. They'll be floating around for 7.5 hours until their breathable air runs out, or until they get hit by space junk and die, or the space junk could cause a hole in their helmet or suit, and then we know what would happen, okay? So yeah, I can see why astronauts are afraid of getting separated from the spacecraft and floating away. Moving on to number 2, we have the re-entry. So let's say everything goes fine. Takeoff was a success, the crew survived orbiting space and landing on the moon. Now the only thing they have left to do is come back home. You'd think that they would be excited, you know, to be back home, eating normal food and, you know, being where gravity is. Turns out returning home is something that they fear, and that's because they could burn up or get destroyed upon re-entry. This happened in 2003 with the Columbia Space Shuttle. Upon re-entering Earth's atmosphere, the shuttle started to disintegrate. Sadly, all 7 crew members on board lost their lives. And now if they do manage to survive re-entry, they gotta worry about landing safely instead of just crashing down full speed into the ground. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the catastrophe. Honestly, I never even thought about this, but according to Chris Hadfield, some astronauts are afraid of a huge catastrophe occurring on Earth while they're off the planet. Now you might think, hey, that's good, at least you weren't on the planet to witness it, but hello, that means that Earth is now in ruins and their loved ones are dead. Who's gonna be alive and at NASA helping them navigate back home? Chances are, nobody, so they would be stuck in space, just orbiting around until they run out of supplies. And even if they did somehow re-enter Earth successfully, they're coming back home to nothing. And that's a pretty dark thing to think about. Starting off this countdown, we had the fear of heights. Now you might be like, why would you become an astronaut if you're afraid of heights? Don't ask me, but NASA astronaut Drew Futzel has a fear of heights, but this hasn't impacted any of his missions. In 2018, days before he was sent back into space, NASA released a video revealing 5 facts about the astronaut that people might not know. For one of the facts, he revealed he is afraid of heights. But like I said, this hasn't affected his missions. He has spent a total of 29 days in space and completed 42 hours of spacewalks over the course of 2 missions. That's pretty insane. Whereas other astronauts think that they're fine and they're not afraid of heights until they go to space and they're like, whoa, okay, look at Earth down there, we're really high up. In our 9th spot, we have the damage. Now in part 1 of this video, I talked about mechanical failures. That's something that astronauts fear. Something that they also fear that is kind of along the same lines would be spacecraft failure. Like the craft itself getting damaged and it starts breaking apart. That's what's protecting the astronauts from space. If their craft breaks down, they are pretty much stranded. How are they going to return home without a vessel to travel in? While extensive steps are taken to avoid this, it can still happen at any moment. They could get hit by a meteoroid or by space junk and it could easily bang up the craft and cause unrepairable damage. Or chemical leaks or air leaks. You just never know. And this is what keeps astronauts on their toes. In our 8th spot, we have the return home. I can only imagine how life-changing going to space would be for someone. It could change an astronaut's life forever, but not always in a positive way. After being in space for so long, they are not used to the conditions of Earth. Some astronauts have developed really bad anxiety after returning home. The cause for this is the constant stimulation. In space, it's pretty quiet. When they return home, they need to get used to the noise of crowds and everything constantly going on around them. This often overwhelms them. Others worry about the physical impact space has on their body. Getting used to gravity again apparently makes astronauts feel really sick, and for months they feel woozy and they feel like they're just gonna throw up constantly. Also, when astronauts return home, it throws off their balance, so it's like learning to walk all over again. Honestly, at this point I'm like, where are the pros of going to space? All I see are cons. Moving on to number 7, we have dying. One of the most common fears in the world is the fear of dying. If you stay out of harm's way, you have a less chance of dying. But for astronauts, well, they're being sent into the unknown. Anything could happen at any given time and they could die. I think we all know by now how dangerous their job is. So I mean, it makes sense that astronauts would be fearful of losing their life in space. Moving on to number 6, we have the orbit fire. This is pretty crazy. Fires in space are very real, and a flame in microgravity can be even more dangerous than a fire on Earth. Why? Well, the flame can survive on less oxygen and can burn for a longer period of time. This actually happened in 1997 aboard the Mir space station. On February 24th, 6 crew members were in serious danger when a fire ignited aboard the craft. According to one of the astronauts aboard the craft, he said, and I quote, "The fire was so enormous and the smoke and vapor coming off this fire site was such that we couldn't see at arm's length, and I could not at that time have imagined that we go on with the mission." Now they did end up putting out the fire, but what made this so dangerous is that it took a while before the fire was even detected. That's because on Earth hot air rises, so the smoke detectors pick up on the smoke and then the alarm sounds. In space, the smoke doesn't flow like that, it will just follow the flow of the ventilation systems, meaning it will take a while before the smoke detectors do pick up on it. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with getting trapped. Imagine being miles and miles away from home with no way to get back. This is another thing that astronauts fear. They get sent into space and it ends up being a one-way ticket. Whether that be their craft malfunctions and there's no way to fix it, or from losing permanent contact with ground control, who knows? But if they do get trapped in space, they're kind of SOL, just floating around for days until they run out of food, supplies, or oxygen, or all of the above. In our 4th spot, we have the oxygen. At any time, a spacecraft could lose air pressure and oxygen and then become a death trap for the astronauts. There's just tons of things that could go wrong with the oxygen in space. Like for the Apollo 13 mission, the crew experienced a blown oxygen tank and the other was leaking very fast. Thankfully, they were able to stop the leaks and had enough breathable air to still make it home. But still, it could have ended much worse. Now, what would happen in the worst case scenario if they lose air pressure and oxygen? Well, the astronauts wouldn't die instantly. They would black out in about 15 seconds because in that amount of time, deoxygenated blood will have arrived to their brain. With no oxygen, the brain shuts down pretty dang fast. Also, low pressures will force the gas exchange in their body to start reversing itself. So the oxygen will be pulled out of your body and thrown into the lungs, where it's released out of the body. If you try holding your breath, your lungs will probably rupture. Then you'll experience hypoxia, your skin will turn blue, you'll lose vision and convulse, among other nasty things like having your body just swell up. So yeah, I can see why that scares astronauts, yeah. In our third spot we have the ammonia leak. This is apparently what NASA trainers tell astronauts. They say, and I quote, "If you smell ammonia, don't worry about running the procedure because you're gonna die anyway." How great is that? How reassuring. So liquid ammonia is used to keep the station's electricity generating solar panels cool. However, ammonia is highly toxic. In March of 2021, 2 astronauts doing a spacewalk outside of the International Space Station had to be checked for ammonia contamination. The 2 were outside fixing the cooling system when frozen flakes of ammonia were released. The astronauts had to have their suits inspected for ammonia crystals before returning to the station. If it's brought inside, well, it's hella corrosive and also a huge irritant to one's eyes and lungs. In our second spot we have the suit problems. Probably the worst time for an astronaut's suit to malfunction would be when they're out on a spacewalk. This happened in 2001 with Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield. He was out on a spacewalk when his left eye suddenly started to sting and fill with tears. Well, the tears ended up forming a blob of fluid that covered his right eye. So he's got his left eye stinging and tearing up, and we got his right eye obstructed by the tears. So he was left blinded while out in space. Now Chris was worried that maybe his eye was stinging because of a toxic gas leak in the suit. So ground control told him to release all the air in his suit to get rid of the potential contaminant. So this guy's in space, he can't see, and now he's told to get rid of all breathable air. I would be like, hell no, I'm not doing that. But Chris did as he was told, and that did the trick. Turns out, thankfully, the thing that irritated his eyes was the anti-fogging agent that was applied to the inside of his visor. So it was nothing deadly. And in our number 1 spot today we have the drowning. Now you might be thinking, Lindsay, how does one drown in space? Well, it's actually much scarier than you actually realize. And this happened on July 16th, 2013 to ECA astronaut Luca Parmitano during his spacewalk. So Luca was out on his spacewalk when he felt water on the back of his neck. Turns out that some contamination blocked a fan pump in his suit, which caused the water to back up and start filling his helmet with coolant water. Soon enough, the water in Luca's suit was blocking his vision. He had no way to clear his eyes, nose, or mouth. Thankfully, he was able to make it back to the space station just in time before he drowned.
In our number 10 spot we have Robin Coulin. Okay, this is a mysterious one to me. Robin Coulin was an astronaut in training at NASA and was in a special 2-year program. He outbeat 18,300 applicants and had many years of schooling and expertise to do so. So hence the reason it was such a shock for the world to learn that he just quit after a little more than a year. According to a NASA spokesperson, it was for personal reasons. Look, I've seen the movies. More than likely, knowing that NASA doesn't have a high turnover rate, Robin more than likely did not quit NASA for personal reasons. We need to get the internet detectives on this case. Did he find out a secret that disturbed him so much that he had to quit? Did he discover that they are really keeping aliens at Area 51? Who knows? My vote is for the latter. Coming up at our number 9 spot we have Mayday. Not specifically NASA, but an interesting story to note from another very awesome astronaut. You may not know this, but South Korea had its very first astronaut go to space in 2008, and it was a very big deal for them. Astronaut Yi So-yin was South Korea's first and only astronaut to quit her job, but for, in my opinion, a very good reason. While on her journey home from space, she was going to find out that it would be far from smooth. She discovered that she was veering off course, which, as you can imagine, was completely scary, even though spaceships tend to be slightly off course most of the time. But in any case, they did land safely, hooray, but they landed 260 miles off course near some shepherds in Kazakhstan. The people of the village thought that they were aliens. Even though she made history, she eventually ended up quitting and decided to go back to school in California. Imagine going out into space and then coming home and deciding to do something else. Damn, that's a life lived. In our number 8 spot we have black holes. Black holes are fascinating. If you haven't heard of a black hole before, well, just know that they are some of the strangest and most fascinating objects in space. They're, quote, extremely dense with such a strong gravitational attraction that not even light can escape their grasp. Apparently, the Milky Way could contain over 100 million black holes, and that was where one of the first black holes was discovered in 1964. It was called Cygnus X1. NASA and Space.com have reported that, quote, astronomers saw the first signs of the black hole when a sounding rocket detected celestial sources of X-rays. In 1971, astronomers determined that the X-rays were coming from a bright blue star orbiting a strange dark object. It was suggested that the detected X-rays were a result of stellar material being stripped away from the bright star and gobbled up by the dark object, an all-consuming black hole. Yeah, that's not terrifying. I would probs quit after learning about this. In our number 7 spot we have aliens. There has been an increasing amount of aerial phenomena, as NASA puts it, otherwise known as UFOs, in the last while, and so NASA has actually announced the assemblage of a team of scientists that will be examining this phenomena. Hooray! NASA said the focus will be on identifying available data, which is the best way to gather future data, and how it can use this information to advance scientific understanding of the issue. The chief of NASA's science unit, Thomas Zurbuchen, has said, quote, we're looking at the Earth in new ways, and we're also looking the other way, at the sky, in new ways. What we're really trying to do here is start an investigation without an outcome in mind. Well, at least they finally admit to aliens possibly existing, and all the conspiracy theorists of the world can say to the people that downplayed all of the evidence, told ya. In our number 6 spot we have space music. This is allegedly from the Apollo 10 mission to space. The astronauts were checking out various equipment to see what would work in space. Of course, the stakes were high because they were actually in space, and who knows if the equipment might blow up or whatnot. But apparently, when they put on headphones connected to a speaker they were testing, they heard a strange whistling sound. They were so amused and a little unsettled by this strange music that they later called it space music. In our number 5 spot we have the space fire. Apparently astronaut Jerry Leininger, who was stationed on the Mir space station, was just having his dinner when suddenly he discovered an extra tank of oxygen-based chemicals catch fire. Leininger said, quote, it was a hot fire burning out of control. Apparently the fire was blocking one of the Soyuz ships that the team would have had to board in order to evacuate, so had they not put the fire out, somebody would have been left behind. Yikes, well that's a little unsettling. Thankfully, they did. In our number 4 spot we have the floating animal corpses. The thought of this is literally horrific, as I am obsessed with animals and refuse to kill even an ant, but hearing this isn't that surprising, as apparently the first living things sent to space were a monkey and a dog. Those poor babies probably had no idea what was happening until they eventually starved to death, which is just sad. Anyways, hearing this shouldn't then surprise you to hear that the corpse of the dog and monkey can be seen floating in space. Imagine seeing that and then having to go on doing what you're doing. My heart hurts. Yeah, if it wasn't already obvious that I'll never be an astronaut, well, I definitely won't be one now, knowing that I may have to stumble across this. In our number 3 spot we have shiny objects. This story is slightly unsettling, but also kind of makes you excited for future astronaut discoveries. Apparently one of NASA's astronauts by the name of Alan Bean has claimed that he saw a really shiny object on the moon. When he was asked to describe it, he said that it looked like shoe leather. You usually would assume that anything from outer space is gray or black, so to hear that there's something shiny just hanging out on the moon is so interesting. It reminds me of that kid's book where that one fish was really sparkly, the rainbow fish. Loved that book. They were never able to learn anything more, but Could this be the moon's version of a diamond? Probably. In our number 2 spot we have They're Watching Us. Allegedly, when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in 1969, it is said that NASA lost transmission for about 2 minutes. Apparently during those 2 minutes there was a secret message to NASA that said, "Those babies were huge, sir. Enormous. Oh God, you won't believe it. I'm telling you, there are other spacecrafts out here lined up on the far side of the crater's edge. They're on the moon watching us." Whoa. Okay, well, I am now a believer in the fact that I'm sure they did not lose transmission, and I'm sure NASA only said that so that the general employees and people watching could not hear what needed to be said. Finally, in our number 1 spot, we have a fleet of UFOs. Apparently, astronaut Gordon Cooper witnessed the most crazy thing in human history, in my opinion. Proof that our future could potentially be Star Wars in real life. He saw a fleet of UFOs. That's right. He claims to have seen it around the time he flew the Air Force. What's wild is that about 10 years later, he'd bear witness to another UFO. Also the luckiest man in history. Allegedly in 1963, a UFO flew towards him. Apparently it was picked up on a radar too, which confirms the proof of existence and Gordon's story. Whoa. Fun fact, I once saw a floating light in the sky, and then I saw it literally zoom away at lightning speed, not lying, so I'm pretty sure I also have seen a UFO.